The words cut deeper than the February chill seeping through the cracked window of my Richmond office. "You're nothing," my sister Clara spat, her voice sharp enough to make the crystal wine glasses tremble on the polished mahogany table. The accusation echoed through the private dining room, a space dressed in navy and ivory where candlelight flickered like it was embarrassed to witness the scene. Yet, across the table, her fiancé, Thomas Reed, leaned forward, his eyes steady, and called me Counselor Wells, with a nod that felt like a lifeline thrown across a decade of silence. My name is Samuel Wells, 54, a retired public defender who still carries the worn leather badge holder from my courtroom days, tucked in my breast pocket like a relic of a life I almost forgot. Have you ever been erased by the people who should know you best, only to have a stranger pull your name from the shadows with a single word? The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, heavy as a stone in a cream envelope with no return address, no trace of warmth. Just the family of Clara Monroe and Fiancé in cold, elegant font, inviting me to their wedding celebration. No, dear Samuel. No nod to the brother who'd once bandaged her scraped knees and taught her how to ride a bike on the cracked pavement of our childhood street. The envelope was laser-printed, precise, smelling faintly of department store perfume, generic, impersonal, like something you'd find lingering in a hotel lobby or a concierge's desk. It sat unopened on my desk for 2 days, wedged between a faded commendation from the Virginia Legal Aid Society and a tarnished brass letter opener I hadn't touched since my last case closed 3 years ago. My office, once a hive of rustling, case files, late-night arguments, and the sharp tang of fresh coffee, now held a stillness that wasn't peace but something heavier, like a breath held too long. I'd retired early, not by choice but by necessity, after a case that fractured. More than my career. 12 years ago, I stood in a courtroom and testified against a family friend, Richard Hensley, a real estate developer whose smile hid a ledger of quiet crimes, evictions that left families on the street, bribes that greased city permits. My mother, Evelyn, called me the night after the verdict, her voice low and unyielding. "We don't drag our own through the mud, Samuel." No shouting, no tears, just those words and the soft click of the phone disconnecting. That was the last time we spoke, the sound of the receiver settling into its cradle louder than any argument we'd ever had. Clara followed her lead, her silence a mirror of our mother's, and the family I'd known, birthdays, Sunday dinners, the smell of my father's pipe smoke in the den, vanished like a Polaroid left too long in the sun. I opened the envelope. Late at night, the city outside my window hushed under a blanket of frost. The paper was thick, pearlescent, the kind that costs more than it should. The invitation was pristine, but tucked inside was a smaller note, written in Evelyn's tight, angular script. "Please don't come. Let her have this day." The words didn't waver, didn't soften, even after I read them 5 times, hoping for a crack in their resolve. They stayed sharp, like her voice had always been, like the way she'd looked at me when I told her I was choosing law school over the family's real estate business. I set the note down, my fingers brushing a stack of unopened mail, bills, charity flyers, and one letter I'd never discarded, its edges yellowed from time. That letter was from Margaret Tate, my mentor, a public defender who'd shaped me more than my own father ever did. She wasn't blood, but she'd been family in every way that mattered. Her voice steady in court, her laughter warm over late-night coffee as we pored over case law. I opened her letter again, though I knew every line by heart. Silence isn't always defeat, Samuel. Some victories are quiet, and they're the ones that last. She'd written it after I declined a speaking engagement at a legal conference named in my honor, too raw from the family fallout to stand in front of a crowd. I hadn't replied. What could I say? That I'd made truth my life's work and lost everything else in the process. That the courtroom, once my sanctuary, now felt like a museum. Of my failures, on my desk sat a small wooden box, its hinges stiff from disuse, Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was my old public defender badge, the one Margaret had pressed into my hand after my first case win, a tenant rights dispute that kept a single mother in her home. I lifted it out, its weight familiar, its edges worn smooth from years of nervous handling. I wasn't sure why I kept it, except that it reminded me of who I'd been before the silence swallowed me. With a sigh, I opened my laptop and typed, Thomas Reed Attorney Richmond. His profile appeared, civil rights lawyer, published in national journals, a rising star with a knack for turning case law into compelling op-eds. One article caught my eye, quoting a case I'd argued in 2009, Williams versus Carter. Justice doesn't shout. It listens. It leaves room for the voiceless. The words were mine, from a ruling that had made it into the Virginia Law Review, but they felt distant, like they belonged to a version of me I'd buried alongside my family ties. I scrolled further, the screen's glow casting shadows across the commendation on my desk. The article described Thomas's work, his passion for tenant rights, his admiration for a case that had set a precedent for compassion. My case, my words. I closed the laptop, the decision settling over me like dust. I was going. Not to prove a point, not to reclaim what was lost, but because those words, my words, had found their way to someone who saw them, who saw me. The badge went back into its box, but I slipped the invitation into my coat pocket, its weight, a quiet promise. The drive to the rehearsal dinner was long, the roads slick with late winter rain. I wore a navy suit, no tie clip, just enough polish to blend in, to pass as a distant cousin or a colleague from Thomas's firm. The venue was a restored barn on the outskirts of Richmond, its rafters strung with fairy lights that glowed like fireflies caught in a jar. The air smelled of cedar and roasted garlic, and the tables were set with crisp linens, polished silver, and trays of appetizers, crab cakes, stuffed mushrooms, tiny quiches dusted with fresh herbs. My place at the table had no name card, just a blank piece of cardstock folded neatly, as if someone had debated whether I'd show up at all. I ran my thumb along its edge and sat down, the chair creaking under me like it wasn't used to holding weight for long. The barn's high ceiling seemed to amplify the silence that followed my arrival, though the room buzzed with the low hum of conversation and the clink of silverware. I sat at the edge of the long table, the blank card in front of me a stark reminder of my place, or lack thereof. The fairy lights above cast a soft glow, their warmth at odds with the chill in the glances that flicked my way. A server moved, passed with a tray of Prosecco, his eyes meeting mine briefly before I shook my head, declining. He nodded, moving on without a word, his tray steady despite the nervous twitch in his hands. I adjusted my suit jacket, the fabric brushing against the badge in my pocket, a quiet anchor in a room that felt like it was tilting away from me. Across the table, my Aunt Lillian, her hair still dyed the same chestnut brown from my childhood, squinted in my direction. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed, her earrings catching the light as she turned away. I remembered her at Clara's high school graduation, her laughter filling the backyard as we grilled burgers, her hand on my shoulder as she called me our family's scholar. Now, she avoided my gaze, her attention fixed on the quiche she hadn't touched. Clara moved through the room like a breeze, all grace and calculated charm, her hand brushing shoulders, her laugh bright but fleeting, like a note played too quickly on a piano. She didn't look at me, not once, her focus trained on guests who fit the narrative she'd crafted, a wedding without a brother, a family without a stain. The menu card, embossed in gold, read, Welcome Dinner for Clara and Thomas, April 2025 at Uvaris. My name was absent, just as it had been from the family Christmas card the year after the Hensley trial. I'd seen this kind of erasure before, in a photo from Clara's law school graduation that once hung in our parents' hallway. I'd been there, standing at the edge, my hand on her shoulder, proud enough to feel my chest ache. When the photo was framed, I was gone, my arm floating without a body. Space constraints, Clara had said when I asked, her voice light, dismissive. I'd nodded then, just like I nodded now, my fingers tracing the edge of the blank card in front of me. Woman, 2 seats down, whispered to her husband, "Who's that man?" He shrugged, his voice low. "Maybe he's with Thomas's firm." Their words drifted over the table, mingling with the scent of rosemary from the appetizers. A server set a plate in front of me. 2 crab cakes, a slice of lemon, a sprig of parsley. He hesitated, his hands trembling slightly, then said, "Mr. Wells," before catching himself. "Sorry, sir." I met his eyes, his face young, maybe 20, with the kind of nervousness that comes from knowing too much about the room's dynamics. "It's fine," I said, my voice steady. He scurried off, his tray tilting slightly. I picked up a crab cake with my fork, turned it over, and set it down. Hunger wasn't the issue. The room itself felt like it was pressing against me, each glance a reminder of the years I'd been absent. At the edge of the barn, Thomas stood, with a groomsman, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp, fixed on me. He didn't look away when I noticed, his eyes holding a curiosity that wasn't hostile but wasn't warm either. He leaned toward the groomsman, said something low and deliberate, then looked back at me. I held his gaze for a moment before dropping mine to the blank card, its crisp fold a silent accusation. I wasn't invisible, not entirely, but I wasn't welcome either. The string quartet played softly, their notes weaving through the hum of conversation, a delicate attempt to stitch the evening together. Clara's laughter rang out, bright and brittle, and I wondered if she felt the weight of her own performance, the effort it took to keep the facade intact. I thought of the summers we'd spent as kids, racing bikes down the hill behind our house, her squeals of joy when she finally outpaced me. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, preserved in a scrapbook no one opened anymore. I shifted in my seat, the chair creaking again, and caught a glimpse of Evelyn at the head table, her pearl necklace gleaming under the lights. She hadn't spoken to me since I arrived, her silence a continuation of the one she'd imposed after the trial. I remembered her standing in the doorway of our family home, her arms crossed, her voice steady as she said, "You chose strangers over us, Samuel." The door had closed softly, but it might as well have been a vault ceiling shut. Now, she sat with her napkin folded precisely in her lap, her eyes fixed on her untouched plate, as if looking at me would unravel something she'd spent years keeping contained. The barn's warmth, the clink of glasses, the murmur of polite conversation. It all felt like a stage set for someone else's life. I was an extra, unscripted, my presence a disruption no one had planned for. Yet Thomas's gaze lingered, and I wondered what he saw, a name from a case study, a figure from a law review article, or something more. I didn't know then that his next words would break the silence wide open, but I felt the air shift, like the moment before a storm. When Thomas said, "Counselor Wells," the barn went still. The string quartet paused mid-note, their bows hovering like birds caught in mid-flight. Glasses stilled in hands, candlelight flickered as if holding its breath, and even the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. I was mid-sip, swirling my water glass to mimic ease, when his voice cut through the room like a blade through silk. The private dining area was a study in curated elegance, tall windows framing the Richmond skyline, tables draped in navy and ivory linens, centerpieces of peonies glowing under crystal chandeliers. My place card still read "reserved," a word that felt like a verdict. Clara sat 4 seats away next to Evelyn, whose pearl necklace gleamed as coldly as her expression. She hadn't spoken to me since I arrived, her silence sharper than any words she could have chosen. Thomas stood at the head table, his glass raised, his voice steady but warm, like a man who knew the weight of his words. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on me, deliberate and unyielding. In law school, I read a case that changed how I saw justice. Williams v. Carter, 2009. It wasn't just about tenant rights. It was about seeing people, not just statutes. The attorney's name was Samuel Wells. He paused, his gaze locking onto mine. Would that be you, counselor? Clara's hand tightened around her glass, her knuckles white, her smile fracturing, like thin ice. The room held its breath, every guest a statue caught in the moment. Evelyn's fork rested untouched, her napkin folded like a shield in her lap. I didn't flinch, didn't smile, just raised my glass slightly, the water catching the chandelier's light. You've got a good eye for case law, I said, my voice low but clear, carrying the weight of years spent in courtrooms where every word was measured. A murmur rippled through the guests. He's an attorney? I thought Clara said he was gone. Whispers skittered like leaves across pavement, soft but persistent. Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished hardwood floor. The sound raw and jarring. He's nobody, she said, her voice slicing through the murmurs like a gavel. He's nothing. The words landed with finality, echoing the note Evelyn had sent, the silence after the trial, the years of absence. All eyes turned to me, waiting for a reaction, expecting a scene. I set my glass down slowly, deliberately, the movement as calm as a judge delivering a ruling. Funny, I said, just loud enough to carry across the table. Nobody, still, got cited in the Virginia Law Review. A glass clinked somewhere, sharp and accidental. Someone coughed, another exhaled. Lillian's eyes dropped to her plate, her earrings glinting as she turned away. Clara's face flushed, not with shame, but with something closer to panic, as if the room's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. She grabbed her napkin, knocked over her Prosecco, and watched it spill across the tablecloth, soaking the peonies until they drooped under the weight. She muttered something sharp under her breath, a curse, a prayer, I couldn't tell, then turned and walked out, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down to silence. The quartet resumed, their notes fragile as if afraid to disturb, the moment further. Evelyn stared at her plate, her lips pressed thin, her hands folded like she was praying for an outcome she couldn't control. Thomas remained standing, his eyes still on me, a quiet acknowledgement passing between us, not of victory but of recognition. The toast was over, but something else had begun. I leaned back in my chair, the creak of wood the only sound I made. The guests resumed their conversations, their voices softer now, their glances more cautious. I was no longer invisible, but I wasn't welcome either, just a name that had forced its way back into the story. I thought of Margaret Tate, her words echoing in the quiet corners of my mind. Some victories are quiet. This wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was a crack in the silence, a moment where the truth I'd carried for years found a voice, even if it wasn't mine. The barn's warmth returned, the fairy lights glowing steadily above, but the air felt different now, charged with something unspoken. I ran my thumb along the edge of the blank card, its crisp fold a reminder of the space I occupied, unwanted, but undeniably present. By 7 a.m. the next morning, my inbox was a war zone. Subject lines screamed in bold font, Samuel Wells, champion or charlatan. Attorneys past haunts family wedding. A blog post recycled a 20-year-old rumor about a case I'd allegedly mishandled, a claim debunked by the Virginia bar years ago but now dressed up in clickbait headlines. A Reddit thread had my face, lifted from an old bar association headshot, pasted onto a cartoon villain with devil horns and a gavel. Classy. The rain outside my office window fell in steady sheets, blurring the Richmond skyline into a watercolor of gray and green. Inside, my desk held the same leather chair, the same chipped coffee mug, and a single open folder with case notes I hadn't touched since retirement. The smear wasn't clever, but it was thorough, a coordinated effort that smelled of Clara's desperation to rewrite the narrative. Anonymous sources, likely her allies, spun tales of professional misconduct, tying it to the family rift, painting me as a traitor who'd sold out kin for ambition. I'd seen this tactic before, in courtrooms where truth was a casualty of ego. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with Lena's name, my former paralegal turned PR strategist. "You've seen the headlines," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, the kind that comes from too much coffee and too little sleep. "Do we push back or let it die on its own?" "We push back," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my chest. "With facts, not noise." By 10 a.m., I'd drafted a response. 1 page, no fluff, just the truth laid bare. It included a certified dismissal of the old allegations, a letter from the Virginia bar clearing my name, and quotes from colleagues who'd worked with me on pro bono cases that kept families in their homes, that gave voices to the voiceless. At the bottom, I added a line in small print. "Truth is its own defense. Oliver Wendell Holmes." Lena posted it to the bar's public archive. No fanfare, no hashtags, just a quiet assertion of reality. By noon, the tide began to shift. Comments bloomed under the worst articles, unprompted and raw. Wells fought for my aunt when no one else would. She kept her apartment because of him. He taught me ethics in law school, made me believe in the system. You don't bury a man like that with lies. The words came from clients I hadn't seen in years, students I'd mentored, even a former opposing counsel who'd respected my work despite losing to me. They weren't orchestrated. They were the kind of testimonials that crawl out of silence when truth is on the ropes. Lena called again, her voice lighter now. "It's working," she said. "The truth's sticking." I nodded, though she couldn't see, and leaned back in my chair, the rain's rhythm a steady counterpoint to the pinging of news alerts. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "You've made your point. Stay away." I stared. At the screen, the words blurring slightly, then set the phone face down. I didn't reply. The folder on my desk held notes for a legal aid seminar I'd agreed to lead, a commitment I'd made before the invitation arrived. I opened it, my eyes skimming the pages, but my mind was elsewhere. On the badge in my pocket, on Margaret's letter, on the photo I hadn't yet seen but would soon hold. The smear campaign wasn't over, but it was faltering, like a fire running, out of fuel. I thought of something I'd told a law student years ago when she hesitated to report a colleague's misconduct. If your truth threatens someone's illusion, they'll fight back with fiction. And here we were, the fiction, crumbling under the weight of voices I hadn't expected to hear. The rain continued, the city hummed outside, and I let the silence settle, not as defeat, but as a space where truth could breathe. The wedding was held in a garden just outside Richmond, under a canopy of ancient oaks draped with Spanish moss. The chairs were arranged in a perfect circle, each one wrapped in ivory linen and adorned with a handwritten name tag tied with silk ribbon. Uncle Henry, Cousin Lila, even second cousins who hadn't surfaced since our father's funeral. Mine, at the edge of the circle, had no name, just a blank card tucked into the linen, its fold as crisp as the one at the rehearsal dinner. I took the seat without comment, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the hum of engineered serenity. Guests glanced my way, their eyes flicking like camera shutters, then darting away, unsure how to navigate my presence. I crossed my legs, hands resting lightly on my knee, and let the silence do the talking. The officiant, a woman with a practiced smile and a voice that carried the cadence of a motivational speaker, began listing those who'd made the day possible. Evelyn, Clara's best friend from college, a florist who'd donated the blush roses that lined the aisle. My name was absent, as expected, the omission as deliberate as the blank card in front. Ah, of me. Clara stood at the front, radiant in a gown that caught the sunlight like spun glass, her expression polished but brittle, like a porcelain figure that might crack under pressure. Thomas stood beside her, his hand steady, a folded paper tucked into his pocket, its edges just visible. At one point, Clara's eyes flicked toward me, a fleeting glance that didn't linger. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something closer, to preservation, like seeing a reflection you refuse to acknowledge. I remembered her at 10, her pigtails bouncing as she ran across the lawn, begging me to push her on the swing. That girl was gone, replaced by this woman who'd built a life. That didn't include me. I sipped from a water glass, the ice clinking softly, and watched the sun filter through the oaks, turning the rose petals translucent at the edges. The toasts began, each one a carefully curated memory of Clara's charm, her diplomacy, her ability to smooth over conflicts. An uncle recalled her mediating family arguments over Thanksgiving dinner, her laughter diffusing tension. Another joked about her knack for winning Monopoly without making enemies. I listened, my face neutral, my hands still. Then Thomas took the microphone, unfolding his paper with a care that felt deliberate, like a lawyer presenting evidence. He glanced at Clara, then scanned the garden until his eyes stopped on me. "I didn't have a father figure growing up," he said, his voice steady but warm. "But in law school, I found a case that shaped me. Williams vs. Carter. It wasn't just legal. It was human, about tenant rights and systemic bias in eviction courts. I remember the attorney not for his name, but for his clarity and courage." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "That attorney was Samuel Wells. Thank you, counselor, wherever you are." The silence that followed was sharp, like stepping on glass. "You didn't see." Clara's smile faltered, her breath catching audibly. Her shoulders didn't move, but everything else in her seemed to unravel. The guests shifted, their whispers soft but insistent. "He's here." I thought he was out of the family. Evelyn's hands remained folded, her pearl necklace a cold glint under the sunlight. Then, without warning, Clara stepped down from the small platform, moving past the roses, past the photographers, and straight toward me. In her hand was a small white envelope, its edges crisp. No one spoke. Forks paused midair. Glasses hovered. Untouched, even the breeze seemed to wait. She stopped in front of me, her eyes unreadable, her face a mask of control. With a precision too calm to be mistaken for emotion, she placed the envelope on my lap and turned away, her gown trailing like a ghost across the grass. The officiant cleared her throat, the music resumed, and the moment passed like a storm cloud moving on. I didn't open the envelope, not yet. The weight of it rested against my thigh, a silent question I wasn't ready to answer. Back in my office, the envelope sat unopened on my desk for days, next to the badge and Margaret's letter. When I finally slid it open, my hands steady but my pulse uneven, I found a single photo, no note, no explanation. It was from our father's 65th birthday, the last family gathering before the Hensley trial tore us apart. I remembered the original. A long banquet table in our parents' dining room, a cake slightly off-center, Clara mid-laugh, Evelyn in her signature pearls, and an unremarkable space where I should have been. The framed version in their house had cut me out, my arm floating without a body, a ghost in their history. In this photo, I was restored, not photoshopped, but whole, standing between Clara and Uncle Henry, my smile caught in a moment before everything changed. I didn't know who'd kept the original or why it was given to me now. Was it guilt? Nostalgia? A quiet apology? It didn't matter. The photo was enough, a fragment of proof that I'd existed, that I'd been part of them once. I set it on the corner of my desk, beside notes for a legal aid seminar I'd agreed to lead, a commitment I'd made to Margaret's memory. Lena bustled in, her watch glinting as she checked the time. "Room's packed," she said, her voice brisk but warm. "They added extra chairs and the press is here. Your name's on the banner, first line." I nodded, adjusting my tie out of habit, not because it was crooked, On the wall behind me hung photos of past speakers, judges, advocates, people whose words had outlived their applause. Margaret's photo wasn't there, but her voice was, etched into my bones. Some records are written in who you become. I slipped the badge into my pocket, its weight a quiet reminder, and followed Lena to the seminar room. The room was full, rows of chairs stretching to the back, faces young and old, some familiar, some new. I spoke without notes, my voice steady, telling them what I'd learned in 20 years at the bar. The law doesn't forget, even when people do. Truth stays, even when it's buried under lies or silence. The room was quiet, not with judgment, but with understanding, the kind that comes from shared struggle. Afterward, a young woman approached, her legal aid badge gleaming, her brown, curls framing a face full of determination. "Mr. Wells," she said, her voice catching, "your case, Williams versus Carter, saved my client's home. It kept me in this fight." I looked at her, really looked, and saw not just gratitude, but grit, the kind of fire that burns through doubt. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the badge, its leather worn but intact. "Keep this," I said, pressing it into her hand, "for when you need to remember why you started." Her eyes shone, too full for words, and she nodded. The applause was soft, steady, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that lingers like a warm hand on your shoulder. I didn't stay for the handshakes, the coffee station, or the reporters hoping for a quote. I stepped into the evening, the photo in my pocket, my steps light on the pavement. The Richmond skyline glittered, its lights softened by the fading fog. No headlines, no fanfare, just the quiet truth of being there, of being seen. I'd been erased, rewritten, and remembered, not by noise but by presence, by the weight of a single case, a single photo, a single moment where truth held its ground. I thought of Margaret, of her letter, of the badge now in a young attorney's hands. I thought of Clara, her envelope, her silence. I'd learned that silence isn't surrender, that dignity doesn't need a spotlight. Family may not always choose truth, but you can choose it for yourself, and that's enough. The photo rested against my chest, a reminder that I'd been there, even when the world tried to crop me out. As I walked, the city hummed around me, alive with its own stories, its own silences. If this story stirred a memory, a moment, or a truth in your own life, share it below. Your voice matters, and so does keeping these stories alive. Consider supporting the channel to help us tell more.